Okay, for those of you that don't know, in a previous life I served for 2 years as a flight physician on board a light flight helicopter program in eastern Pennsylvania. And learned a lot, got to fly to the scene of some pretty spectacular events with a flight nurse and a pilot, of course. And gained a lot of experience from that in my early emergency medicine training. And then was hired probably for that reason alone to come back to WVU when we were just starting HealthNet helicopter program here in West Virginia. And I got to be one of 3 medical directors that started the program with a physician in Charleston at CAMC and a physician in Huntington. So from that standpoint, let's talk a little bit about aircraft operation. The difference between fixed wing and rotor wing, or airplane and helicopter, as they're called. Certainly the rotor wing aircraft can glide a distance if the engine quits because it has lift from the wings, and it can fly fast and it's pretty fuel efficient. But the big disadvantage is number 3 here, it can't land it where we want it to land. So airplanes, though there are air ambulances, they're mainly for if you get injured in the Caribbean cruise that you go on, a fixed wing will fly you back to Miami to a tertiary care center. Those kind of things are what we think of for an airplane air ambulance. So most of what we'll be encountering here in West Virginia is rotor wing or helicopter service. Unfortunately, they're not fuel efficient at all, and they burn about 50 gallons of jet fuel an hour. And they can only hold about an hour and a half max of fuel, maybe 2 hours. Some of them hold 2 hours of fuel. And so if we were to fly from Morgantown to Charleston on board HealthNet helicopter system, you're about the max range of a helicopter. So to fly back from Charleston to Morgantown, we have to stop and refuel somewhere. And that brings up all kinds of issues like, well, do you want a patient on board the helicopter as you're pumping 75 gallons of jet fuel into this thing 15 feet away? And the answer is no. So generally you have to unload the patient and to refuel. Also, helicopters are very expensive to begin with, a lot more than an airplane in general if it's similar size, in the range of $4 to $7 million for a light single-engine helicopter. HealthNet has started out with single-engine helicopters, and I was very unhappy with that because all the flying I had done was on a medium-sized twin helicopter. And twin-engine helicopters, you're thinking of flying at night over mountainous terrain, West Virginia, southwestern PA. What happens if the engine quits and there's nowhere to land? And so many of the helicopters that we're flying with HealthNet are light twins. And we'll talk about that more. The big advantage is you can land wherever you want to land, pick out a 100-foot by 100-foot area that's not sloping too much, and they can land there. As far as hover, they can hover, but mostly that's the most difficult thing, even for a helicopter, is trying to hover in one spot for very long. And so we don't want to make the pilot do that if we can help it. Pick out a landing spot, get them on the ground. They can carry bright night sun spotlights that light up a large area, and even more concerned, they can carry FLIR or forward-looking infrared to pick out people by body heat at night, although the rescue helicopters we have here with HealthNet and Air Evac don't have that. They didn't want to get into the business of being search and rescue at night over mountainous terrain, and you can imagine some of the difficulties that adds a whole layer of complexity to it. But we do have FLIR on board. What is it, Trooper 2? 5? Okay, out of Maryland, Medevac. And the Health Net and Air Evac helicopters don't have hoists on them, so that you're, winching someone up from the ground. That's more of a large scale, either state police or military helicopter. So this Health Net, which is one of the two services in West Virginia currently, started in 1986, and with the 3 helicopters we started with, one in Huntington, one in Charleston, and one here, became the first statewide hospital-based helicopter program in the United States. That program since 1986 has grown to 10 locations across West Virginia, over into Ohio and Kentucky. So I thought I'd give you a map, and actually I have handouts here that have some of my slides on them. So if you're anywhere in the north central West Virginia area, you may get Health Net 1 based here in Morgantown at the old Kmart. It's the old Kmart place over there on the hill in Westover. Or Health Net 6 out of Buchanan. Or, as you'll see in a moment, you may get another helicopter.
Bill, there's, you go back to your slide. 10 is over just south of Wheeling now, in Martinsville area. Right there. What about there?
Yeah, I don't know why. This is a brand new slide they just sent me and didn't have that.
It's interesting. But they're flying DC-135 out there. So.
Good. The second program that's in West Virginia that came about 8 years ago, 6 or 8 years ago, is Air Evac Life Team. And it's a large corporation that has 130 bases across 15 states, mostly in the Midwest is where they started. I think their base is in Missouri. And they have an interesting idea that you can sign up as a subscription plan for $85 a year, and it covers anyone in your immediate live-in family. So if you need a helicopter and it's medically required and requested appropriately, they will not charge you for that flight because you paid your $85 a year.
They will take what your insurance pays as full payment.
Is that right?
What it means is they won't balance bill you for the rest. But your bill is going to be 5 figures.
To give you an idea how much, and to finish this out, they have locations in these 4 areas in West Virginia: Summersville, Logan, New Martinsville, and Beckley. To give you an idea how much the charges are, Health Net Aeromedical flew my father from Braxton Memorial down 90 miles south of here, and I got the bill for $19,500.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Medicare paid.
Low. That's low by aeromedical standards.
I think 8. Medicare paid 8, and I think we got balance billed for 2,000 or something like that. So flying a helicopter nowadays is very expensive. I'm told that if you are over in the Swiss Alps, where a lot of this started, and you call for a helicopter, you better have your credit card with you, or you don't get rescued. They don't take a promise to get paid.
Bill, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Do you know why that Summersville and Beckley, why there's one so close to each other? The Summersville and Beckley's pretty close, aren't they, to each other?
I don't know much about this program, so I don't know the answer to
well,
that.
they're trying to. They've kind of tried to put themselves in places where they could be closer to certain calls.
Well, I know it's newer before.
Okay, so they've tried to intersperse themselves between the Health Net bases. Is one of the things that Aerovac has done. And the other thing is they're flying those damn dinky little Bell 206 helicopters, which are underpowered, single engine, and much shorter range than what Health Net's flying. So Beckley and Summersville seems like it's pretty close to each other, but when you're talking about the range limitations on that aircraft, it starts to make a little bit more sense.
I wasn't going to be biased and bring that up.
I will.
But I would be rather hesitant to get, if I were down in a New River Gorge, I wouldn't want this helicopter coming down in there after me unless I was really about dead.
Especially today.
Because on a hot summer day, the air is so thin, they don't have very much lift. And with a single engine Bell Jet Ranger or Bell 206, they just can't get out of a tight area. They don't have enough lift. It's a single engine helicopter. If I was looking back here at, this is an EC 135 or 145 at Morgantown, and we have two engines up here on top. The smaller aircraft that Health Net flies, is this a 130 or 135?
135.
That's a 135.
That's a 135.
Has
They've
had
got some
its
130s,
problems
but
getting in and out of places.
Yeah.
At one time, Health Net lifted off with a patient down in a deep, rugged area with like a mountain here and a mountain here. And as they lifted off, tried to lift off, the helicopter slowly settled back to the ground, and it was pulling full power, and it landed when they didn't want it to land. And that's when actually we got this in Morgantown, because we also fly emergency medicine residents in training occasionally, and other Health Net training a new person. You can fly 4 people on this as a crew instead of 3 with the smaller units.
Oh, the other thing about that subscription service from Area Vac Life Team that you might want to know, that would only apply if they happen to be the service that's sent for you. Because you as the patient don't get a say. It's not like you call them directly. It's the closest available aeromedical asset. Yep. So
if you call MedCom, and I called MedCom the other day to just ask them how this still happens, since I used to work in MedCom, WVU MedCom, and basically they're saying if we call and tell them our location, we get dispatched the closest helicopter, be it Area Vac or Health Net, we get the closest helicopter, which makes sense. I've added since last time the siren radio frequencies, Hilo 1 and Hilo 2, where the magic number at the top, 598-4100, gets you WVU MedCom. As you can imagine, helicopters don't fly well in icing conditions or lightning or hail conditions. And so the last thing you want to be is try to be air evac in a situation like this, because you're really asking for major trouble. Can it fly in rain? Sure, it can fly in light rain. It comes off the cockpit canopy real well, but we don't fly in lightning storms, and we don't fly in very bad weather, which is a big limitation. Does Air Evac do night vision? I presume they did
I
not.
don't think so.
Health Net crews are all trained up in night vision goggle certification. So in a totally dark area, which West Virginia at night is, in the rural areas, this is the kind of stuff they see. They can still see a pole here, a utility pole. They can see if you're up high, basically at night flying, you can still see ridge lines. There's enough light that you can see ridge line to maintain straight and level flight. But then you drop down below the top of the ridges, you can't see much. With night vision goggles, it amplifies around 30 to 50 to 100,000 times. But as you see looking there, you have a very narrow range of vision, a field of vision, which is a problem. But at night, when Health Net is landing, the pilot everyone has these flipped up on their helmet, and they can flip them down and watch as the helicopter descends. And for this reason, the pilot may request that all the white lights be turned off at the scene. There should be an LZ coordinator or landing zone coordinator, and that is one person, not 3 people trying to call or talk to the pilot or the flight crew at any one time. Should be one designated person on scene, and these helicopters won't land unless there is someone there on scene talking to them on a radio. That's one of their backups. And you shouldn't be having chit-chat conversation with them. This person makes sure there's a safe LZ, establishes radio contact, assists the pilot in landing and locating the LZ, which we'll talk about in a moment, pointing out any utility poles, wires, other obstacles that might be a problem, and keep everyone else back at least 200, preferably further away. The communications, again, should be kept to a minimum, especially when the aircraft is approaching the LZ. The pilot has enough to worry about without talking to you, unless you see something that needs called out, and anything that is a hazard needs to be called out. But otherwise, even internal to the helicopter, no one is talking during that time. When I flew on board, I wasn't allowed to open my mouth when the helicopter was either taking off or landing, because you don't want any distraction of what the pilot's seeing and doing. The flight crew will call the LZ command about 3 to 5 minutes before they get to where they think the scene is. Any description that you can provide them about how to come in and approach from the west or the east or the south would be very helpful to them. And remember that it's the pilot's perspective about the LZ, not your perspective. So try to picture yourself up there in the air about 2,000 feet looking down. What's the pilot seeing? And describe the landing zone to that person. The minimum LZ site is 100 by 100 feet. It should be relatively level, less than 6 degree slope, and should have a rather firm surface or low-cut grass or hard-packed snow, and to avoid these things at the bottom, gravel, dirt, dust, all that stuff's going to blow up. If you've ever been near a helicopter landing, all that stuff blows up from the rotor wash. And if you blow up gravel and ding a rotor blade or the tail rotor, then the helicopter is down until maintenance comes out and checks it. Yes?
We are in a landing zone, and so you were talking with the pilot, and we see a problem that you don't see. Is there a universal word, like we use rock for a falling object no matter what it is? Is there
Stop.
Just stop, is it?
The flight crew, if they see any wire or anything, most flight crews say stop, and the pilot just stops in midair and hovers it until they figure out what was
So if someone on the ground sees the same danger, they should holler out, just stop.
That would be reasonable, I would think. I've never heard a ground LZ coordinator do that, but
Well, if
sure.
something runs out into the field that you didn't
Yeah.
see, you know.
And they do. And that's part of the LZ, the team landing this helicopter's responsibility is to prevent that. We had a guy in a Cadillac sedan DeVille drive under the helicopter it was landing, and it was like 20 feet off the ground, 30 feet off the ground, and this guy came out of nowhere with his car and drove right under the helicopter, and it could have been a major disaster. Biggest problem with helicopters is hitting wires. Let's go back. Let me go back to some pictures here, way back. And that thing right there is your only defense, really, is a wire strike protection system. There's one on top and there's one on the bottom. And so if you hit right, if a wire is running horizontally across here and it strikes the front of the helicopter, it will usually go up into that one, or it may go down into this one. But if you hook the skids into a wire just below this bottom wire strike protection system, or hit it directly with the rotor blades, it could be a real problem. We were landing in a cornfield with a fire department on scene, and it was just getting dark. And they had a light out in the center of where the helicopter was supposed to land, and they had it marked off really well. And as we descended about 20, 30 feet off the ground, the tail rotor struck a wire. And the helicopter landed safely, but the mission was off at that point until maintenance came out and checked the tail rotor and actually had to replace the tail rotor. If you allow blanket, sheet, tarp, anything to be sucked up into the rotor blades, which is why you don't tend to load hot. Loading hot means we land at the scene, rotors are still turning, and the flight crew gets out and says, let's go, because there's a storm approaching. So you load hot in that circumstance, the rotor blades are turning. Well, you don't want IV poles coming out to the helicopter, you don't want a tarp to blow off. A set of rotor blades is about $75,000. There are 2 sets on the helicopter, so $150,000 for a set of rotor blades. So don't want to do that. Okay, so we have a better picture later, and I gave everyone a handout of the larger picture. But basically, notice the direction of the wind and the direction of the approach. So if there is wind, and you can determine that by a flare, putting a flare off, or causing some smoke, then we want to land the helicopter into the wind, because wind is what, or air under the rotor blades is what gives it lift. And we want to have lift as we're landing. And so we're approaching into the wind, and notice if there are white lights crossing the scene to show a night landing, we want the vehicles here shining that way and here shining this way, not landing the helicopter into the headlights. In other words, we want the headlights pointing away from the pilot as the pilot lands. But a better picture here in a moment. So we want the overhead area clear of power lines, wires, antennas, trees, and we want to keep everyone else out. Stumps could overturn a helicopter. Like we clear the site we're going to set the gurney down on, or the Stokes basket down on. We don't want to land one of those skids on a stump. Okay. We need to clearly mark the LZ, and if you use orange cones, they need to be weighted, put a rock on the base of them or something to hold them down, or they'll just blow away. Chem sticks are good. Beacons that cross from headlights are good. These are good if it's marking only the 4 corners of the LZ with a fusee or flare. We don't want a flare in the center, right where the helicopter is going to sit down, obviously. You could have a chem stick there, but not something that is going to ignite a fuel leak. Flagging tape should not be used because it will just blow away. Never shine any spotlight at the helicopter. A big problem with helicopters now is people using their lasers and pointing at the pilot. And then they can't see very well. That's now a federal crime, I'm told. Let's see, I talked about the light. So here we go. You have this picture in your handout. So if we had a fire truck, or position our Jeep Wranglers there and shine across, if it's a night landing, we have the flares in the 4 corners. Notice the wind direction, and we're landing the helicopter into the wind. I liked whoever designed this particular slide. And that answers a lot of questions that are on your FTM requirements regarding LZ setup. So, directing the helicopter, the flight crew will contact the LZ coordinator when they're a few minutes out. tell the pilot when you can hear the helicopter and then also when you can see the helicopter, but that doesn't mean they can see you, right? We've had people say, well, look down, we're by the white church. And I actually had an old slide that from the pilot's standpoint, there were 5 white churches in view. You know, there are churches everywhere and they're all white, right? And so pick out some landmark that they may be able to see, or a flare. Don't assume they can see you just because you can see them, but give them direction. Once you see the helicopter, think of the front of the nose of the helicopter being at 12 o'clock position, tail rotor back there at 6 o'clock, and say, we're at 10 o'clock position off to your left, or we're at 9 o'clock position, etc. And so then the pilot knows exactly where to head. We don't want any unnecessary vehicles or personnel in the LZ. We want most people back 200 or 300 feet. And as you see from this photo, the prop wash is going to blow dirt and stuff in everybody's eyes. And so ideally, people landing the helicopter and they're close by need to have protection with eye protection and preferably even hearing protection for these takeoff and landings. One of the things that, let me see if it's on the next slide. Yeah. One of the things that confuses EMS people a lot when they've never done this before to land a helicopter is when the helicopter lands, even if they're going to shut down the rotors, they have to cool the oil in the engine before turning the rotors off. And it takes 3 minutes by a clock running in the cockpit to turn them off. And so you're all excited and you have a critically injured patient there, and you're saying, and so Health Net has landed, and you're like, why are they not getting out? You know, I've got this guy here that needs flown out that's critically injured, and they're just sitting there in the darn helicopter. Well, they're sitting there because they're going to shut the rotor down to load, but they can't shut it down for the 3-minute cool down time, or whatever that particular helicopter is. If they do load hot, you don't just run out to the helicopter. You only go out here if someone's motioning you to come, and then we're going to talk about that direction. This particular helicopter loads from these clamshell doors in the back, and there's a tail rotor sitting right here about 4 feet to 6 feet off the ground. You can see the person, the pilot here, standing in front of the tail rotor. And this particular helicopter has a shroud around the tail rotor, but many helicopters do not have that shroud, and it's just a straight rotor blade flying around, and it looks like a disc there, and you can barely see it. And people have walked into that and been killed by that, not by Health Net. Actually, there was a security guard on top, a hospital security guard on top of a hospital in Philadelphia. I think it was the Philadelphia Children's, CHOP, and he was out helping unload the helicopter and somehow forgot and walked into the tail rotor and killed him on the roof of the hospital. Okay, so never walk. The pilot can't see. The pilot's sitting on the right side up here in front. He doesn't have any rear view mirrors, and he can't see back here at the back. And so if he sees you going past his door, he's going to start really worrying about you because he's worried you're going to walk around to the other side and walk into the tail rotor. So, in summary, what are the potential hazards of ground personnel? Certainly injury from the main rotors. That rotor disc, you said, well, it's way up there, right? It is up there, but it tilts. It tilts in all directions. And if a large gust of wind hits, even while it's there on the ground running, it can tilt that disc of the rotor blades down to where it could potentially hit you in the head directly in front of the helicopter. We talked about the tail rotor, we talked about the dust problem, the hearing problem. If you got up against the helicopter, you could get some burns from some of, depending on where the exhaust is. People have been burned on the exhaust. There are all sorts of things protruding out from the helicopter that are very expensive if you break them off or ram them into you, such as antennas that you don't want to touch. We talked about the approach, and the safest approach in full view of the flight crew and only when they signal you is to approach from the side, so that you're not up here in this front area where the main rotor blade could dip down, and you're not back here anywhere around the back of the helicopter where the tail rotor is. And this seems kind of logical, but you wouldn't want to approach the helicopter walking down this bank, right? And walk into the main rotor. You would want to approach it from the downhill side. Hoist operations, which we would get into only if we had the National Guard helicopter or perhaps the Trooper 5 from Maryland come over. And that is, there can be a large buildup of static electricity on that hoist cable, and so as they're hoisting it down to the ground, you don't just run over and grab it. You can actually get knocked to the ground from the static charge. And let it hit the ground and then go pick it up if that's what you want to do. You never obviously hook the hoist to a tree and then a strong wind comes and drifts the helicopter a little bit, and now it's jerked into the ground by its fixed hoist. There is a ammunition fired cutoff, usually right at the base of those hoists, that if the person operating the hoist is really up on it and watching closely, if they see that the hoist is caught on something, they can fire this ammunition, and it fires a knife into the cable and actually cuts the cable loose, cuts the steel cable. We don't want to do that. We don't want to hover long, like we talked about. Hovering takes a lot of fuel. As a matter of fact, let's talk about, for one moment, we talked about HealthNet having 2 engines. What if one of them blows up? Can it fly on 2, you think? Or can it fly on 1?
No.
It can, and that's the advantage of it, but it can't hover and land on one. So we've had problems where I was actually in MedCom giving the medical side of things to the flight crew that they were going to the scene of an accident, and I got really long-winded and learned a big lesson there, describing where they were going and why. And when I stopped talking, you know, if I'm talking, transmitting, they can't we can't hear them, right? Sort of like with your siren radios or your handheld radios with MARG, if somebody's transmitting, that's all you hear is their transmission. So I was talking to the helicopter, and they were over the Ramada Inn, leaving Morgantown, and a engine governor went out on one of the engines, and it allowed that engine 1 to rev to max RPM. And the pilot identified the problem and said, we've got a governor failure most likely, and shut that engine down, and now ended up with engine number 2 only. And I got really scolded for talking to them too much when they got back, because as soon as I shut up, they said, we're declaring an emergency for Morgantown Airport. I was like, oh my goodness. But the helicopter, a twin-engine helicopter, has to come in at about 40 miles an hour onto their skids and make a on-skid landing, preferably at an airport, to land on one engine. Okay, Stokes basket, if we're hoisting someone up, we don't want them just to climb on and straddle that hoist at the bottom. You know, if you're in water, that's okay, if you're being swiftwater rescued, but if you're an injured person, they're not going to just come down and grab you and take off. And we know how to do that. Let's talk very briefly, since it's in your 8 requirements for FTM, about approaching the scene of a aircraft crash.
Hey, Bill, I'm sorry, on the hoist issue, before you go into that, if we need Trooper 5 from Maryland to hoist someone out, we need to make that explicitly clear when we call in the request, because they don't carry the hoist gear all the time. They'll have to load it on the aircraft from the base and configure the aircraft for the hoist before they take off. So you can't, if they show up overhead and say, okay, we need you to hoist, we haven't told them in advance, they're not gonna be able to do it.
I don't know of any incident where they've ever hoisted anyone here in this state.
And they don't like to do it. They'll try to avoid doing it if at all possible.
It's very difficult. That's why Altnet doesn't do it. Okay, this is actually Bell Jet Ranger that didn't have the right lift. When HealthNet started, there had been, in 1986, there had been another helicopter program called West Virginia State Police Medevac that supplied 2 Bell Jet Rangers, one here in Morgantown, based at the hospital, and one in Charleston at CAMC. And they flew 3 years, from 83 to 86. And during that 3 years, they didn't fly at night, so they only flew like 300 missions between the 2 helicopters, and they crashed both helicopters. This is the one that crashed in Preston County. Part of the problem with helicopters is if you're going to do EMS medical stuff, you need to do medical stuff pretty much. If you're going to look for marijuana in marijuana fields, you need to look for marijuana fields, and the two don't mix real well. And so this was the state police pilot and a Preston County deputy sheriff, as I recall, looking for a marijuana field over next door, in the county next door, and I'm not sure why they crashed. I don't know if we ever did find out on this one. No one was killed in this crash. I think this deputy sheriff received a broken leg. The other helicopter was a medical mission out of Charleston, was requested to fly from Davis Memorial back to CAMC, and it was icing conditions, a storm approaching, and the pilot called the hospital, Davis Memorial, and said, get the person outside, we're 5 minutes out, but we've got to make a quick turnaround with a hot load. And that should have been a signal there, this is something wrong. And they loaded the patient on board as a hot load and took off, and the aircraft iced up in a snowstorm about a mile from the hospital, and crashed and killed everyone. So this didn't work well. So if we ever get called to these, there are some hazards involved with an aircraft crash site. We know that it could be a hazmat incident, and there's a lot of unburned fuel on board, jet fuel. There are batteries that could be leaking hydrochloric or sulfuric acid, one or the other. And if it's an airplane that flies above 8,000 or 10,000 feet, they have oxygen tanks on board, obviously. So we've got a lot of stuff here that would make for a nice hazmat incident. We should be worrying about a possible post-crash fire. We should be worrying about toxic fumes coming out of the accident scene or the crash scene, and thinking not necessarily in this area, but perhaps even over in adjacent Maryland counties, a lot of agricultural aircraft carrying insecticides and other bad stuff flying over crops. If it's a military aircraft, we think of the potential for explosion due to their onboard weaponry, or, and this is when I was looking for the answers to these, is there's often an ejection seat there, and if you pull the wrong lever, getting a pilot out of a fighter jet to crash, you just now ejected that seat right through, right there on the ground. Or it has an explosive charge under it that you could detonate. So these are some things to worry about. We should always approach it upwind, because we don't want these toxic fumes which are blowing downwind, and then we're trying to walk up that direction. Also, you wouldn't want to approach it from below. If it's a sloping terrain, you wouldn't want to walk uphill to the crash scene, preferably, because the jet fuel, if it's leaking, is going to be running down, and you'll be thinking you're walking through a stream, and you're wading through jet fuel.
A lot of these modern aircraft have literally miles of wire in them too. They could get out and be a real tangled mess, could get caught in, trip over, cut on.
Okay, good. Why would we want accurate documentation? Well, we know this is a potential crime scene. It's also a major NTSB investigation scene to find out why this aircraft crashed. And so we don't want to disturb anything other than a person that may need help as far as medical care. And if someone's sitting there dying in the crash site, then do what you need to do. I got some of this from this slide from an online area for a sheriff's deputy talk in Texas, talking about them approaching and taking control of a crash site, aircraft crash site. And they basically said if you move a living person to give them care, to take a photo of where they were in the crash area before moving. I don't know who's going to stop and get out their iPhone and start snapping pictures of injured people before thinking about applying care to them. I'd probably just jump in and start giving them care if I could. And certainly if there are different areas of the wreckage, perhaps the tail end of the aircraft's broken off up here on top of the hill where it hit, and then the rest of the plane lands down over the hill, we want to try to mark some GPS coordinates of the various components of the crash. As far as methods to secure the crash site, it asks for 3. We all mostly carry flagging tape. We can block roads to the area, but we still want to have ambulance and civil air patrol and those type people being able to get in. This is basically, other than providing some medical care and locating the crash, law enforcement, civil air patrol, and firefighting people will be taking over this scene very quickly.
We as a group, we don't have any legal authority to restrain people and keep them from approaching a downed aircraft. But you can ask them nicely, and if they refuse, take a picture of them so that you can give that to law enforcement later on.
So ideally setting up a perimeter with rope or flagging tape, and even maybe establishing a no smoking perimeter even beyond that would be a great idea.